voice of the Cayman Islands, Radio Cayman.
Shining down from above.
We love our listeners.
Radio Cayman in the Cayman Islands.
Live from Radio Cayman Studio, this is
Money Sense, bringing an informed financial perspective to the Cayman community.
A very good morning and warm welcome once again to Money Sense. I'm Simon Caudry and I'm joined this morning in the studio by my co-host, Georgie Loxton. Good morning.
Good morning, Simon.
I believe you've been exercising already at this early hour.
Yes, well, that's what you got to do, right? Up with the birds.
Sure, yeah. Okay, that's what I do every morning before 7 o'clock. Yeah, I go out exercising. Right, lost track of what we're doing. Today's show is going to be a conversation about a topic that typically vexes me. I like to approach these shows with a warmness and alacrity, but every so often we have to address frustrating topics and ones that leave me ever so slightly exasperated. It's therefore vital, Georgie, that you're here to bring some levelness to this conversation, some thoughtfulness and some calm wisdom. So thank you for joining. Now, a lot of mouthful of nouns and adjectives there, and I realise I haven't even mentioned the topic of this morning's show. We're going to be discussing pensions, and we're going to be discussing what's happened to them in Cayman and what people could be doing with the money as a result of the pension legislation that recently changed. So, Georgie, perhaps we should start off this morning's conversation with just reminding people where things stand, insofar as the pension legislation allow people to take money out and just what the options now are for people. Because people have done stuff, but not everybody has yet completed the forms, or not everyone has thought it through as wisely as they want to. So perhaps just set the scene for us.
Yes, and last time we spoke about this, Simon, it was very fresh and we were trying to give advice around whether people should pull.
Yes.
And I think it's clear that most people have pulled the money from their pension. We've got a couple more months. Where are we now? August?
Yes.
So it's, I think, October.
Okay. End of September, isn't it?
Is it the end of September, beginning of October? You have until then to decide whether to pull the first 10,000 CI from each of your pension funds. If you have more than one, you can do it from each, and 25% of the balance. Okay. And from, studying social media comments, particularly on some of the Facebook groups.
Is it possible to study social media comments? Don't they just...
Oh, no, that's such a bad word. Yeah.
That implies there's more sense that goes into social media.
I'm a lurker. I don't comment.
Stalking.
Yes,
Stalking.
But I do read people's comments, particularly on things around money. It's clear that most people have done it. And we were just talking before we came on air about the herd mentality that is an affliction for us humans, I think. It comes from our evolution. If we were out on the plains of Africa and you were part of a pack or a tribe, you didn't want to be left at the back because you were the one that got picked off by the lion. And that was responsible for the toilet paper hoarding at the beginning of the pandemic. And now I think it's responsible for this pulling money of the pension, because I've spoken to many people in passing who have said, well, I wasn't going to pull my pension money. I didn't really think, I needed to. I was going to leave it there. But everybody else has done it, so I thought I should.
Not only did they think they didn't need to, but they often had no reason whatsoever to do so. No plans to spend the money, and then potentially go and do something unwise in the sense of long-term economic welfare. We'll obviously come on to that.
So I think a lot of people are now sitting on, perhaps more cash than they've had in their bank for maybe ever. Tens of thousands of dollars that they've pulled from a pension. If you've been here in Cayman and you've been contributing to a pension for anything more than 10 years, you've probably pulled out, 20, 30, 40, maybe depending on how many pension plans you have, of course. If you've got more than one, you'll have pulled out more. But tens of thousands of dollars. And really, for people, as you say, who didn't have an immediate need to live on that money because they were still employed, they're really wondering what to do with it. And I think most people do want to make a sensible decision. They do want to do something sensible. But because we're never taught about money, and I always say to people, we're never taught how to manage our money at school. We're just sent out into the world with all this knowledge about the Greeks and the Romans and trigonometry, and no one ever tells us how to manage our money. And some people learn it along the way. Some people are lucky enough to be taught it from their parents, but most people, it doesn't matter how smart and intelligent they are and how successful they are floundering, and they just don't know what to do with their money.
And often, if you don't know what to do, that often means you make a mistake.
Absolutely.
And this comes to the point I have droned on to every single friend who still speaks to me. incessantly, which is the pension legislation allowing people to take the money out, solved a absolute need for a certain slice of society who had no job, had no income, and it was an essential, necessary tool. But for the other 60% or 70%, whatever the exact percentages are, who had no need for it, all this is going to do is create the need in the future for taxation in Cayman in order to be able to help people survive in their retirement, because it's unambiguous that pensions will not, before this, pensions were not anywhere remotely sufficient to pay for retirement. After this, I don't know what less than remotely sufficient is, but they are substantially less likely than that before. So I think before this, people were going to expect to retire on around about 25 to 30% of their final salary. So just think about that. Before you took your money out of your pension, your likely final salary, take that, so you're earning your $50,000, your pension each year was going to be paying you perhaps $15,000 to $20,000 a year. That's what you have to live on.
Mm-hmm.
Now, after doing this, it's probably going to pay you $7,000 to $8,000.
You've taken out more than a quarter, than a quarter.
Which is something that, very basic maths, compounding and all the rest of it, it will destroy your future prosperity in retirement.
Mm-hmm. Yep. I can't disagree with that.
Those people who were otherwise going foodless or unable to do what they needed to do, so buy electricity, buy water, for those people, yes, there's a much more pressing need, which was survival. And so this was a very sensible policy. But there are many other people, most people in Cayman, frankly, who had no need for it, who will simply be burdened on the Cayman government in the future. Yeah. And that's a real problem. So that's my vexation out of the way.
Yep, I agree. So you read the blog post that I
did,
put out yesterday.
On your website?
Yes.
Which is whatever the page for that is. What is the website page?
It's libertywealth.ky.
There you go.
I wrote a piece to try and help people who have got this money sitting in their bank account. And
you came up with a 9 point.
But there are 10? More. You should always do odd numbers, Simon. You don't know that little fun rule?
No.
Someone once told me.
There we go.
I tried to think of all the things that people could do with their pension money. And there were a few that I didn't put on there, but most things. And
Vegas wasn't on there, but then you can't travel.
Right. Vegas is not an option.
And gambling, obviously, not allowed in Cayman.
So trying to just give some sort of balanced argument as to whether each of these ideas with your pension money is sensible. And, I start by saying this is not financial advice because I don't know you and I don't know your individual circumstances. But should we run through some of those thoughts? Well, why don't you pick a couple that you particularly liked?
Well, there was one I definitely didn't like, which is buy a luxury toy such as a car, boat or other such things.
Right, that was number 7.
Number 7, yes.
Yeah. And I followed with, I don't really need to write anything about this, do I?
But actually, and I've had many anecdotal stories about this from people who have been planning for a year to buy a new car, have gone to the dealership recently and found that there's no inventory in many of the dealerships, or the inventory that's on the forecourt is actually already pre-reserved for people. So people have taken their pension money, in many cases, gone out and bought a $20,000 car, which is a lot of money. I'm sure it's a lovely car, so I'm not criticising any car dealerships yet. They've got and bought
that's on the low end, $20,000.
Yes, fair point. So they've got and bought a $20,000 car, which depreciates by about 30% each year. So in 1 year's time, that will be $6,000 less, and then in 2 years' time, it will be $12,000. So, well, math is wrong there, but it will be substantially less in a couple of years. So by the time 5 years' time, this will be worth close to zero. So they've gone and spent $30,000, $20,000 on something that won't be worth anything.
Yes, you could have probably just set fire to that money, and you're sort of coming to the same. From a
retirement perspective, you'll have nothing as a result of it.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, it's completely and utterly disastrous, and I don't think it's just cars. I think it's boats.
Yeah.
Well, houses is sort of separate, I suppose, and any shiny object, I think. Disaster.
Yeah, and that's a real important thing, because one of the things that people have reasonably said, I think, is, well, I've got this pension money, I can do better than the pension plans, and we'll talk about that. And perhaps the argument, perhaps that's true. Perhaps it's possible. Historically in Cayman, people have invested a lot of money in property and it's gone up and done very well. So it's not unreasonable to make the argument that if I put my money in property, I'm going to do better than my pension plan. The maths over the last 20 years probably supports some of that. But it's unambiguously not the case that buying something which depreciates so rapidly, a boat, a car, which has no long-term store of value, is a very, very bad idea.
And people know that.
Yeah.
That's the thing. And I always talk about the difference between knowing and doing.
Yeah.
There's a really big gap between those two things.
So what causes people to do this then? Just because they've got a lump of cash and they don't want it to sit in the bank account?
It's the live in the today mentality. I started the blog post by saying, the reason that we have a pension plan is because we're trying to counteract our human instincts and human tendencies, which is just to live in today and say tomorrow and the next decade. We can't. It's very hard for us humans to look out that far. And, the arguments of, but I might get run over by a bus tomorrow. Or I don't trust the pension plans anyway. I mean, what other things did I come up with? I have bills to pay now. I'm young, right? I'll save later. I'll worry about retirement later. Those are the kind of arguments that we put forward in our head. And of course, the other thing is, I was just listening to a brilliant podcast as I was coming in with a chap called Rory Sutherland, who was head of a very big advertising agency in the UK, talking about human behaviour and how we think that our decisions are driven by logic, but they're driven by emotions, right? And it's really, really dangerous. We sort of think that there's this thoughtful process going on in our minds, and there's not really often. And I think that's very much the case here.
Yeah, and I think to put some of this in context, I did a show last week with Sterling on a lunchtime show, and we had a caller who said, if I've taken my money out and I've got 100,000 in my pension pot remaining, and I rather callously interjected and said that's called poverty in retirement, because you divide 100,000 by 20, which is the life you might be living.
20, 30.
Well, it depends on how aggressively you consume during your earlier years and what your lifestyle is. But I was trying. 20 is much easier to divide by. I can't divide 100 by 30. Goodness me. So that's still not a lot of money.
No.
100,000 divided by 20, we're talking $5,000 a year plus a little bit of return. You're maybe talking $6,000 or $7,000 of income from your pension each year.
Mm-hmm.
And there's I would challenge anybody in Cayman to rationalise and say I could live on $7,000 a year in Cayman in 10 years or 15 years' time. Remember, prices will be more in 15 years' time. So your $100,000 will spend less for you. So
prices will probably be about double.
Yeah. So the reality is that you've got a situation where people who may have taken 25% out, so they've taken their 25,000, they've got 100,000 left. In order to be able to retire in Cayman on, let's say, $30,000 or $40,000 a year, you probably need a pension of something like $1 million.
Right, $1 million is a ballpark.
Now, I doubt there's almost anybody in Cayman right now who has a pension pot of $1 million because of many reasons. But 100,000 to $1 million is a long, long way.
Yeah,
and you ain't going to get there if you start withdrawing the 100 and make that smaller.
No. And you're totally right on that figure, because if you look at the government drawdown schedule, which is actually how you're going to pull the money out of your pension, there is now a schedule. It's somewhere around 4%. Of the pension pot that you can take out a year, because 4% has been deemed to be a safe withdrawal rate by people who research this stuff. So if you have $1 million, that's your $40,000. Right.
And that's not an ideal situation, is it? To think, how do you get to $1 million? You get there by putting money investing each year, by investments doing well, not by taking the money out. And so if people buy an asset which is depreciating and becoming going to be worthless in just 5 years' time, they've ruined their chances, and they have caused, inevitably, they will have caused poverty for themselves in their future. And the only way you solve poverty in the future is either people die or government has to subsidise them. And not many people in Cayman would be terribly happy if tomorrow we introduce taxation, 15% personal taxation rate, in order to pay for those retiring. Well, that's what will have to happen in 15, 20 years' time. Yeah,
and I think we'll see more social issues from this as well, of course. I speak to a lot of people who are supporting their parents in Cayman, actually, young, successful professionals who are helping out their parents in retirement. And, of course, that cycle is going to continue in that as the people who are now sort of in their 40s and 50s age, they will be relying on their children. And that's really tough for kids who are working to be funding their parents' retirement.
Yeah, for sure. Now we've got, I think we've got to take a break very, very shortly. But after the break, what I think I would like to talk about is perhaps we've gone through the vexatious stage this morning. I've got the anger out, so I think therapy is working for me, Georgie. Thank you very much.
Good.
I think after the break we'll focus on those ideas that people have which may have some sense, and then the implications of some of those. So let's take a brief break and rejoin us in 60 seconds.
89.9 Radio Cayman helps you to weather the storm during this hurricane season.
One of the most crucial elements of hurricane preparedness is storm awareness. During the season, it is of utmost importance to pay attention to the latest local weather forecasts, as hurricanes do not suddenly form or strike. There are various methods of advanced notification. Utilizing such may be the difference between a favorable outcome and disaster. Both television and radio serve as excellent mediums with up-to-the-minute storm path information in the wake of a hurricane. Another method of tracking a hurricane may be only arm's length away. Your smartphone or tablet can be your most valuable tool before, during, and after a storm, providing countless numbers of apps with crucial hurricane information. Many apps allow you to track storms with moving radar and satellite imagery, plus offer alerts, current conditions, forecasts, advisories, and even video.
This hurricane preparedness tip was brought to you by your community radio station, Radio Cayman 89.9 FM.
This is
Money Sense, bringing an informed financial perspective to the Cayman community. Brought to you by the CFA Society Cayman Islands.
And now, more Money Sense.
Welcome back to Money Sense with Georgie Loxton joining us, talking pensions and what to do with the money that you may probably have taken out of your pension. We touched before the break on the things that will have annoyed us about the pension law, the registration, the regulations, and some of the things that people might do. Now we've got a list of potentially reasonable things that people may want to do. And I'm going to quiz you on some of those and get your reaction. So some people will say, okay, I've been rather overextending myself for the last year. I've bought too many things. I've had too much of a good time on vacation. I've spent too much at Amazon. I've got a $15,000 credit card bill, and credit cards are expensive. If I take out this pension money, I can save myself. I can pay off my pension. I can pay off my credit card debt. What about that as a suggestion?
It's very hard to argue against that as a suggestion, because you're probably paying 15 or 16% interest rate on your credit card, and your pension fund is probably not going to make 15 or 16% on an ongoing basis. I mean, there's been the odd year where you might have had that sort of return, but we can't get at that sort of return going forward. So if you were to take your pension money and pay off high interest rate debt, and we're talking credit card debt, personal loans that might be at high interest rate, perhaps car loans that are at high interest rate.
So something 8% above kind of thing.
Yes, anything over 8%, absolutely. If you pay that off, you've then got a shortfall in your pension fund that needs to be addressed. But if you were to take that monthly payment that you were spending to service that debt and add it back into your pension fund, you would do better over the long run doing that, because you've taken cash, you paid off a high interest rate, and then you're adding to your pension pot going forward. My question is, are people going to do that? It's a big behavioural step, and I think the danger is that you tell yourself you're going to do that. Yeah, sure, I'll take that. I was spending $1,000 a month servicing my credit card debt. I can keep living without that and add it to my pension money. But will you?
Yeah, I suppose at least if someone's asking that question, they have the mindset which is of good intentions.
Yes.
So if someone who is listening today is saying, well, I've listened to you, and actually you're saying it's probably a good idea to reduce high interest debt, so 10-15% debt, get rid of that, pay it down, because that's costing you a lot of money each month. But then the important next step then is to be incredibly disciplined about what you do with that $1,000 each month that previously you were paying to service your debt, just to pay the interest on your debt. What are you going to do with that? Don't do something rash and crazy with it, because go back to the first half of the show when we talked about if you don't have enough in retirement, you will be in poverty. So do something sensible with that.
And putting it in as a voluntary contribution into the pension plan, I think, is a fairly sensible thing to do.
Or someone could say, and this links, I think, to one of the other options on your blog post, which is rather than putting it into the pension system, which who knows what government regulations will
there is that risk.
will come to grace us with their presence in the few years' time. Maybe I should open up an account at Charles Schwab or Interactive Brokers or whoever it might be, and just go and buy an index tracker. Just go and buy S&P 500. What about that then?
I think that's a great idea. I think you can't really go wrong. And I think I said that if you're going to invest it yourself and you have the discipline, this is the big bit, it's so behavioural. If you have the discipline to put it in there and leave it there till retirement and not, panic when the market falls 20% and take it all out and put it into the hot thing that's going up by 100% a year. If you can avoid those big behavioural mistakes, you're going to do better than most people around you if you stick it in an index fund.
And so with all due respect to one of our other co-hosts, Adam, please don't go and buy Bitcoin with it just for the fun and the adventure.
Yeah, no.
Do something sensible with it.
Absolutely. And
Bitcoin has its place, I'm sure.
A low cost, ideally globally diversified index fund. But, the S&P 500 is, it's 55% of the global stock market. It's a pretty good place to start.
And it's in the currency. It's in the region you're probably going to spend your money in eventually.
Absolutely. Going back to the paying off high interest rate debt, though, the thing that worries me about people doing that is not just the fact that they may not make any catch-up payments into their pension, but it's that often there's an underlying issue that's caused someone to get into that debt in the first place. And if you don't address that, which is that there's probably not enough money coming in and there's too much going out, if you don't address that, you're probably going to find yourself a year, 2 years, 5 years down the line back in that same situation.
So first of all, be honest with yourself. Are you spending more on a monthly basis than really you can afford?
Yep.
If the answer to that is yes, make a change and then do something sensible once you've made that change so that you protect yourself in the longer run.
Absolutely. And this is really, I just can't stress how hard this is for us humans to do these things.
Yeah. Now you mentioned about investing yourself, and I've got another little bugbear of mine, which is that I'll just say this rather bluntly. There's a problem with brokers in Cayman, which is there was a case recently from a broker that liquidated, which is that assets in brokerage accounts in Cayman, as they currently stand due to a High Court judge decision and SEMA's attitude to it, aren't actually segregated. So I have said to people, do not invest in a brokerage account in the Cayman Islands because it's dangerous.
Absolutely.
Your money is not safe in a brokerage account if that company goes under. In any other country in the world, they're segregated, apparently not in Cayman. Right. And it was a travesty of our legal system.
Yes. But you can open an interactive broker's account in your own name in the US and you're fine.
Now, a lot of people will say you're taking money out of Cayman, and the simple answer is absolutely, because the law here is an absolute stupidity.
No, I'm totally with that. There are a few, I don't want to get into all the caveats of doing that now, but there are a few things that people need to be aware of and need to be a bit careful of when they are investing in a US brokerage account.
There's some issues if you die in it, you've got to have a will written and all those other things.
But there are ways to get around. There are ways to get around this, and that's the thing.
That's where financial advisors come in.
Right, exactly. Doing it yourself, it sounds really easy, but most people listening might not even know what an index fund is.
Yeah, that's
right?
true.
It's you've then got to go out and you've got to research it. You've got to think, well, okay, what is an index? There are, I don't know how many. Hundreds of thousands of these things, right? You've got to figure out which one to buy. You've got to get around these estate tax rules in the US. There's more to it than you think, and that is where a financial advisor comes in.
Yep. Now, I'm going to ask you about property because there will be, and there have been a lot of people who have said to me, I should go and buy property. But I have one little prelude to that, if I may, which is I've seen adverts on social media. As unhappy as I am generally to observe social media, it pops up on my phone frustratingly, and it's still there. I've seen adverts, and I get crossed by these adverts, and so it's the morning, and I've not yet had my calming chamomile tea, so I'm not yet calm enough. But there are adverts on social media which say, invest your pension money in property, invest your pension money in real estate, invest your pension money in solar, and invest your pension money in other things. And that really frustrates me because as an investment professional, the word investment should be a regulated activity. If I go and invest someone's money into a bond or an equity, I'm subject to regulation by the regulator, SEMA. Why on earth can people go out on radio, on TV, in social media and use such words, suggesting to people these are considered actions and these not subject at all to any sort of regulatory oversight? That annoys the heck out of me, and it would not be permitted in any other country, but it is permitted in Cayman. So if you're listening and you say, oh, well, these people, they say invest, they must be talking sensibly, that is not legally true, and they're not subject to any standards of advertising.
Oh, Simon, I had a real rant about it as well when I started seeing those ads come up. The property thing.
So property. Let's go back on track.
We kind of got to separate buying your first property, getting on the property ladder, versus someone who already owns a home and is thinking about buying a second rental property. So maybe we'll focus on the second option because that's probably the more common one.
Because rental property, people say, okay, I buy a property, it's going to go up in value over the long run, and that historically that's correct, it has done. That's the past, not necessarily the future. And then I'll earn income each month from those people who are very happily paying me rental income.
Yep. And we know all the issues with that argument, right?
Go on. Well, let's go through them.
Okay, so there's so many things, and I tried to write about some of these in the blog post if people want to go and read it. First of all, you're pulling from a globally diversified pot of assets, right? And you're putting it into one thing, one asset, a house on one little island in the Caribbean Sea, right? So there's that diversification piece to start with. The second thing is property can be a good investment, and certainly in places in Cayman, not across the entire island, but in places in Cayman, you've done extremely well if you've bought well and you've sold well. There's a timing issue there, and there's certainly an element of luck in making a good return on a property over a somewhat short period of time. Over a longer period of time, property, if you look in the US, which is where we've got the longest data set, the Case-Shiller Index, it's gone up a little over inflation. I think it's something like 3.8% a year over the long run. The price of property in the US. The US stock market has gone up 10 to 12% over the long run, right? So there's a big disparity in the return of property versus the return of the stock markets. And the return of the property index does not include the costs involved in owning that property,
which are extraordinarily expensive, particularly in Cayman.
Insanely expensive. I mean, we look at our house and there is always something that needs doing to our house, something that needs fixing. There's, this over here, there's that over there. Owning property is incredibly expensive, and people hugely underestimate that. And when they say, I bought a property for this, if you can see my arms down here, and I sold it for this up here, what they never say is, and I spent all this money along the way, right? It cost me this much to buy it in transaction costs.
And what about transaction costs? Yes.
Yeah, in transaction costs. It cost me this much to sell it in transaction costs. And I spent all this money maintaining it. I did a bit of a refurb. I painted, I added a deck. I had to replace the AC system, and I paid the interest to the bank, blah, blah, blah.
But the counter argument to that would be, but I'm renting this out, so there's going to be some nice person who's going to be paying me $2,000 a month in order to live in my property.
Is there, though, going to be that person paying you $2,000 a month?
Now you're being confrontational to me.
That's the question. And, we have seen empty properties during this COVID crisis.
Well, because no one's coming to Cayman.
Exactly. Rents have come down. If you are relying on a rental property as your only source of income in retirement, right? That's what you're going to be living on. That's how you're going to be paying your own bills. You are taking a huge risk, because what happens when you have that property empty?
What happens if there's a hurricane and the island is closed to visitors for 4 months?
And if it's your retirement and you've got a pot of money, and the AC system breaks down and it's going to cost you $5,000 to fix it, where's that $5,000 coming from? That's what bothers me. And people say, Georgie, you're so anti-property. I am not anti-property, because everybody needs a home to live in. And I always encourage people to buy a home, and I always encourage people to pay off their home as quickly as they can, because there's a great psychological benefit to that.
So could that be a thing then? Pay off some of your mortgage?
I think there's an argument for that. Again, you've got to play catch up with your pension fund, though. But if, let's say, you take that pension money and you lump it into your pension, and therefore, all other things being equal, you're going to pay your mortgage off earlier, and then you take that. Once you paid your
5 years earlier, that's spare money you have in 5 years.
Exactly. That let's say you were paying, I don't know, $2,000 or $3,000 a month on your mortgage, and you added that to your pension fund as a voluntary contribution. You might be able to pay catch up. I would have to do the maths on that.
Fair enough. Well, I thought I was supposed to be the angry one this morning. You're supposed to be helping calm me down with.
Yeah. Now I'm getting worked.
Now I've managed to wind you up. So apologies for that. But we are regrettably, as always, almost out of time. We've got 1 more minute to go. So any last final thoughts that you want to give to somebody?
Oh, Simon, there's so much, really, isn't there? I mean...
Talk to a professional, perhaps.
Yeah, talk to a professional, but be careful with the professionals you talk to. I said that. I think... I don't know of any instances in Cayman, recently, where people have been taken advantage of.
Not perhaps recently, but there certainly have been.
Exactly. And
in the last 15 years, I can think of 2 obvious ones.
Yeah. The conditions for fraud are very ripe today. Yep. And I think that it's very possible that we'll start to see scams, and people have handed their money over to something or somebody, and it has turned out to be a scam. Yeah. Cayman's a small place. Ask around. If you sit and you speak to a financial advisor, ask around. Do you know anything about this person? Blah, blah, blah. Do your due diligence. I joke in my blog post, and it's not really a joke, that people do more due diligence when they buy a television than they do when they give their money to somebody to invest. I
spent hours before when I researched my television.
Yeah.
Important stuff.
Yeah.
Wow. Okay, look, we are, as always, unfortunately out of time before we finish a conversation, but I hope Georgie's words have been of some use to some people who are listening and just help spark or just help crystallize some thinking in your mind. If you are thinking about taking money out of your pension, or indeed have taken money out of your pension, do be very careful about what you do with it. Your long-term future and your long-term prosperity is at risk if you behave unwisely. And I think if you can talk to a really good professional, Georgie or others that might be on Ireland, then that's something that certainly would seem to be eminently sensible, because you need to plan yourself given what otherwise the mistakes that you most inevitably will make. So Georgie, thank you again for joining us this morning.
Thanks for having me, Simon.
Look, absolute pleasure. Now, I have to give the final notes, which are involving social media and such like. So bear with me as I stumble through this. I just want to remind everyone that today's show will be available as a podcast on the CFA Society Cayman Islands webpage, and encourage you, if you have a question or a topic that you wish us to cover, then email us at moneysense@candw.ky or tweet us at moneysenseradio. With that, thank you once again, and do tune in 2 weeks' time.